Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on episode 56 of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. Alright, so last we left off, things were heating up considerably. Sloth is dead, and Wrath has returned. So, despite sort of taking control of Central Command, it seems like things are a bit more tenuous than they were before, if only because Wrath being alive now presents a challenge to what was presumably Mustang's rightful authority. So, rather than get to any of that stuff, we are instead focusing on Hohenheim here, presumably not too long after the fall of Xerxes. You know, I guess understandably, he's not coping too well with having a bunch of souls stuffed inside of him. You know, I'd imagine that's a rather traumatic thing for an ordinary person to have to cope with. And this is almost sort of like in accordance with legends that were touched on briefly, where the Shingis came across, you know, a golden man, as it were. So, you know, it's interesting that Hohenheim was in such a bad state, because I feel like with all these souls inside of him, essentially powering him, I feel like even something like exposure in the desert wouldn't be enough to kill him. I mean, sure, he might not be feeling too good, but I doubt it would be enough. So I think it's fair to say that this was a pretty low point in life for Hohenheim. You know, his country and everyone he had ever known had essentially been snuffed out overnight. And he's basically been saddled with, you know, half a country's worth of damned souls. And, you know, at that point in time, all they could really do was wail and bemoan the fate that befell them. So I feel like this was sort of what Hohenheim was speaking to last episode, you know? Because he referred to himself as we or us. You know, the idea here is that Father treats humans merely as cannon fodder or a fuel source, but Hohenheim knew them as people, or I guess knows them as people. You know, like he couldn't have known all of these people in life. At least it's not likely. But, you know, it seems like the idea here is that he has grown to know all these people throughout the intervening years. So it's interesting that Hohenheim has essentially, well, I don't want to say like weaponized these trapped souls, because like they're doing it of their own accord, you know. Like Hohenheim has basically taken the time to get to know all the people trapped inside him and sort of, if not swayed them to his cause, they're sort of sympathetic to it anyways. So this is something that makes the Philosopher's Stone even more horrifying, because Father, you know, he finds it hard to credit that a Philosopher's Stone could still retain the individuality of its component souls, but, you know, Hohenheim seems to have proved that given a long enough period of time, he can sort of sort out the tempest of souls and sort of get some kind of order. Yeah, that really is nightmarish to be basically saddled with 500,000 disembodied souls. And, you know, they're certainly not going to be happy about their situation. Like, and I can only imagine how much work it would actually take to, you know, get them all to essentially, like, calm down, listen, be kind of rational so you can figure out what to do going forward. Because, I mean, for the trapped souls, you know, there really is no good outcome. Because, like, some of them, they have to be essentially expended as energy to enact whatever's going on. I don't know if that's a particularly painful process to be used up like that, but that so many of them do it willingly, I think, is telling. Now, you know, Hohenheim seems to have been fooled into thinking he was making progress here, but he's really only succeeded in making Father show his true monstrous form, which is, I guess, a sort of humanoid version of that little dwarf in the flask. So it's interesting that Hohenheim thought that by basically rupturing the skin that contained Father, that would undo him. I guess it would make sense way back in the day when all that was basically holding him together was a flask, but, you know, he's had how many years to work this out? Surely he's come up with a workaround. So back with Wrath and Company, things are very interesting. You know, Wrath has decided on a direct frontal assault, seemingly as a matter of pride here. The idea being that if he were to sort of concede that this was like a tricky defense, you know, that would only give them credit he doesn't feel they deserve. And I mean, to be fair, he's doing a rather good job in basically forcing a tank to retreat. I mean, I can't exactly say why they'd be so keen on staying away from him. I mean, surely they do know what he's capable of, but they're also a tank, you know. If all he has is a sword, I can't imagine he's going to be able to do much. You know, I say that, but then he just sort of like cut through the vision slit, stabbed that guy in the face. Man, that sword's gotta be made out of something rather remarkable, considering he was able to shear through tank treads with little difficulty. Like, I'd imagine it's probably a pretty common point of failure on a tank, the tread, but for a normal sword to be able to just shear through it like it's basically nothing. I mean, once again, I'm getting out the tweezers here to nitpick. It's cool. He just took down a tank by himself. So, now he's surrounded by about a score of men and Captain Buccaneer, but even considering that, I feel like it's hardly a match for him. Yeah, Wrath isn't playing around, Captain Buccaneer is pretty formidable, but just like that, Wrath kind of just dispatched him. First slashing with the sword, then destroying his automail. And, it's not like he's incapable of doing anything without his automail, but that was a big part of his combat capabilities. So good on Lieutenant Volman, he's not willing to acquiesce to Wrath's demand that he open the gate. It's nice that he's so sort of apologetic that he's going to end up dying. So fortunately for the Briggs soldiers, it seems as though the cavalry has arrived in the form of Greed. So, if ever there was someone capable of taking on Bradley one-on-one, it would most certainly be Greed. And that's rather fortunate for all those other soldiers who surely would have been slaughtered. Yeah, it is interesting how the Central Forces have become all around more competent now that Wrath is back. I guess the prospect of him breathing down their neck really inspires them. So now that Mrs. Bradley knows that Wrath is back, I feel like this complicates matters somewhat, because obviously Wrath is not going to do much good, and Bradley was sort of like, I guess, a sympathetic figurehead. So without this, Mrs. Bradley isn't going to be as useful as she would have been otherwise. Yeah, so things have gotten rather tenuous, They can't have word getting out that Colonel Mustang was doing something untoward, so that means they sort of have to pin all the blame on Briggs, which is rather unfortunate considering that the Briggs soldiers were, the traitors. I mean, they're not. It's unfortunate that they kind of have to get thrown under the bus. Yeah, it's interesting that they're sort of bringing it up themselves, that sort of publicly siding with Bradley is backfiring now that he's back and he's basically opposing them. I mean, I guess they were really banking on the fact that he'd be out of commission or dead for long enough, but yeah, it's rather unfortunate. Yeah, they're definitely in a very tenuous position where they have this facade of being on the same side as Wrath, but if it comes down to proving it, they can't really do that. So it seems like Greed is rather keen on round 3, as it were. You know, he kind of fought Wrath to not really a stalemate, but he sort of like retreated before things could get really dicey. It seems like this time, retreating is no longer an option, you know. I wonder what exactly Greed's trying to do here. You know, if he's attempting to goad Wrath into reckless action. You know, I feel like that's really not gonna happen. You know, it's almost interesting how Wrath is basically complaining about being old and stiff when he essentially completed such a feat of physical dexterity. You know, it's interesting that Ling and Greed sort of have a better relationship now that they can sort of freely trade off who's in charge here. And it's even more interesting that they're both basically have reason to either help out or oppose Wrath. So here we have it, you know, the big reveal, I guess. Wrath doesn't actually have a blind side. And in fact, without the eye patch, he's probably more effective, given that, what did he call it? The ultimate eye, I believe. I mean, between that and his sword, which can seemingly cut through tank treads and stone and everything, like, it's gonna take a lot of stuff to put him down. Like, I'd imagine the defender's best bet would be, you know, attrition. Just throw men after him and basically try and, like, just dull his sword with their bodies. It's a rather heartless approach, but I don't know, somebody like him, you can't beat him one-on-one. You know, even Captain Buccaneer, who is reasonably renowned, like, he basically had to fall on the sword to immobilize it. So unfortunately for everyone, Wrath is basically proficient in whatever weapon he decides to pick up. So while those combat knives might not be as good as his sword, you know, he won't have much trouble cutting a bunch of people down. And I do have to say, he did manage to scratch Greed on the cheek. I feel like he's not using his ultimate shield as much as he could do. You know, just put it all over your full body and you'll be basically invulnerable. You know, you don't have to worry about getting nicked by a sword here or there. Yes, another counteroffensive has begun. They're basically retaking the main gate back from Briggs' forces, and it seems like they're in a pretty good position to do so, unfortunately. Yeah, everybody's in a bit of an unfortunate position. The lieutenant sort of has to lead the defense of the main gate, and Greed has to contend with Wrath. Neither of them are really up to their respective jobs, but, you know, considering the pinch they're in, there's not much choice. I mean, fortunately, the brig soldiers seem to be using their heads a little bit. Staircases can be used as a choke point. As long as you just keep up some suppressive fire, they can't get up. So I feel like this is going to lead to an unfortunate circumstance where people are going to have to charge emplaced machine guns. And that's not going to be very good for anybody who's forced to do it. Of course, it seems like there are other reinforcements here to help out the brig soldiers. While the machine guns did most of the work, there's still a few soldiers sort of hiding out in the stairwell. I'd imagine they're not going to be too long for this world either. Yeah, so this is kind of an unfortunate circumstance where nobody really knows whose side this interloper is on, and so they both sort of shoot at him. In reality, he's on the good guy's side for want of a better term, He's here to help out Lang. I feel like something like this might even the odds. Despite being old, Fu is a rather hardy combatant, so between him and Greed, they might be a match for Wrath. It remains to be seen, of course. Ooh, I forgot. This is personal for Fu, considering he maimed Lanfan. This is personal now, things are gonna get real serious. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.